The music was playing, the guests were smiling, the chandeliers were glowing, and in that perfect golden moment when I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I realized the man I was about to marry had vanished, leaving me standing in a white gown that suddenly felt like a funeral dress. The air inside the ballroom was sweet with roses and champagne, but behind the curtain, all I could smell was panic. My father's arm trembled beneath my hand. I could hear my name being whispered in the crowd, soft, curious at first, then restless, then sharp. The orchestra repeated the same melody for the third time. Something was wrong. Ethan Carrington, the man the world called the perfect son, perfect heir, perfect catch, was missing. My groom, my dream, my promise. I had seen him that morning, smiling, confident, kissing my forehead as he said, "Nothing will ever separate us again." I had believed him with all the faith a woman could have. And now, as the music looped endlessly, I could feel my belief breaking bone by bone. A bridesmaid ran toward me, her heels clattering on the marble floor, her eyes wide and wet. She didn't need to say it, but she did anyway. "He's gone," she whispered. "He left." It was as if the whole world tilted. I remember gripping the bouquet so hard that the stems snapped between my fingers. My mother gasped behind me. My father muttered something to the planner, but I heard nothing. The noise around me dimmed, and for a few long, paralyzing seconds, I could only hear the sound of my own heartbeat. Then my phone buzzed in my trembling hand. A message. From him. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." 5 words. That was all it took to destroy everything I had built my heart around. The doors to the ballroom opened. People turned. Whispers spread like wildfire. The bride was still here, but the groom was gone. I remember walking through the hall in silence, hearing cameras click and reporters outside shouting my name. Someone laughed. Someone pitied me. Everyone watched. And as I stood under the shimmering chandelier, with my veil trembling in the air-conditioned breeze, I felt my dignity peel away one layer at a time. Ethan's mother didn't even look at me. She passed by, her perfume heavy, her voice icy. "I told him this would be a mistake," she said. I think that hurt more than the message. Within hours, my humiliation became entertainment. Social media exploded. My face was on headlines before I'd even reached home. Billionaire groom escapes gold digger bride. Carrington scandal. Bride left crying in couture dress. Society wedding turns public disaster. They called me names I had never heard spoken aloud about me. They laughed. And Ethan, he stayed silent. I turned off my phone, closed the blinds, and spent 2 nights in the same white dress, makeup still streaked on my face. The pearls pressed into my skin as I slept on the couch. I thought I had been humiliated, but humiliation is a small word for the kind of death you feel when the person you love makes you a spectacle. I replayed every moment in my head, trying to find a sign I had missed. The hesitation in his eyes, the unanswered calls, the way his mother's hand lingered on his shoulder at dinners. Was I too blind? Too hopeful? Too desperate to believe in love when love had never believed in me? By the 3rd night, I felt something stir in my chest. Not anger, not hate, just emptiness. And yet, beneath that emptiness, something else moved. A pulse, a flicker, a small quiet reminder that even in ruins, something can begin again. I sat in the dark, pressing my palm against my stomach, and for a moment, the silence didn't feel so cruel. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't alone in that room. Something was growing inside me, a secret that would rewrite everything Ethan thought he had escaped. Morning light poured through the blinds, touching the same wedding dress still hanging by the window like a ghost of everything I'd lost. The flowers from the ceremony were already wilting in their vases, their sweet scent turning sour in the heat. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, pale, swollen-eyed, and broken. And yet behind that wreckage of mascara and silence, I felt something unfamiliar, something stirring quietly beneath the pain, like a secret heartbeat refusing to die. I thought it was grief. I was wrong. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken a word since Ethan disappeared. The world had already decided who I was, another foolish girl who dared to love a rich man. I kept replaying his text in my head, each word slicing deeper. I'm sorry. I can't do this. It echoed in my skull until even breathing felt like punishment. But that morning, as I stood barefoot on the cold tiles of my apartment, a strange heaviness settled in my stomach. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something that whispered, check. I opened the drawer in my bathroom, the one filled with forgotten things. An old pregnancy test rolled to the front. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, my fingers trembling so hard that the box slipped and hit the floor. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that this was just stress. But deep down, I already knew. The seconds stretched forever as I waited, heart thudding against my ribs, the sound louder than my breath. I paced, turned away, counted backward, prayed for nothing. And then I saw it. 2 bright pink lines, bold, unmistakable. For a moment, the world went silent, completely still. I sank to the floor, clutching the test in my shaking hand. My throat burned. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. Pregnant. I was pregnant, with the child of the man who had abandoned me in front of the world. Tears slid down my face, but they weren't from sadness. They were from disbelief. Fate hadn't just broken me. It had bound me forever to the man who destroyed me. I imagined his reaction. Ethan's perfect mother's smile twisting into disgust, whispering, I knew she'd try this. His friends were laughing behind their champagne glasses, the tabloids calling it revenge, a ploy, a trap. I could already see the headlines. The gold digger's final move. Carrington Heir's bride strikes back. No, I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let them taint what I was carrying. I decided no one would know. Not Ethan. Not his family. Not the world that mocked me. I sat in the darkness that night and whispered to the tiny life inside me. You are not his mistake. You are my miracle. I started taking better care of myself. Small meals, long walks, vitamins that Amara insisted I take once she found out. She didn't judge me. She only said, you don't have to fight this alone. But deep down, I didn't want help. I wanted control. The last thing I had left. I wanted to protect this secret, keep it safe from the gossip, the power, the name that would swallow us whole. So, I built walls around my silence. I stopped answering calls. I took freelance work from home. My world became smaller, quieter. Every heartbeat inside me became louder. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd talk to the child growing beneath my ribs. I told stories about courage and pain, about beauty and betrayal. I told it that love doesn't always come wrapped in promises. It sometimes hides in survival. Months began to blur together. The pain dulled, but never vanished. The city moved on from my scandal, but my body carried its consequence in secret. I thought I could disappear quietly. But fate has a way of dragging secrets into the light, especially the ones you hide for love. I didn't know it then, but my silence was about to betray me. One fainting spell at work, one ambulance ride, and one stranger's kindness would uncover my secret, and nothing would ever be the same again. I thought hiding the pregnancy would protect me from shame, from judgment, from the Carrington name itself. But the human body doesn't lie. It speaks when we refuse to. And mine chose the worst possible moment to scream for help, right in the middle of a classroom, in front of 20 students, when all I wanted was to disappear. I had been living in survival mode. Cheap food, no rest, too much stress. Every day, I taught other people's children while silently protecting the one growing inside me. I hadn't told a single soul outside of Amara. I didn't want pity. I didn't want attention. I just wanted peace. But peace isn't something the body grants when it's starving, when it's exhausted, when the soul is running on fumes. And so, one afternoon, while I was handing out worksheets to my 6th grade class, my vision blurred. My knees locked. The paper slipped from my hands. Then, darkness. The sound of gasps, a scream, a child calling my name. Then silence. When I woke up, everything was white. White walls, white sheets. Monitor beeping beside me. The faint scent of antiseptic clung to the air like tension. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I saw her. A woman in her 40s. Dark skin, calm eyes that saw too much, and a voice that sounded like warmth wrapped in iron. "I'm Dr. Amara Blake," she said. "You fainted from extreme fatigue, and you're pregnant." Just like that. No soft landing, no denial, just the truth. I sat up too fast. The room tilted. I grabbed the rails of the bed and looked at her with panic. "You can't tell anyone," I said. "Please." She didn't flinch. "I don't plan to," she replied, "but someone has to take care of you. And from the looks of it, you've been doing a terrible job on your own." I don't know why I trusted her. Maybe it was the way she didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. Maybe it was the way her tone carried strength instead of pity. Maybe it was the way she stayed silent long enough for me to breathe. She gave me food. Real food. Not instant noodles and crackers. She checked my vitals, drew blood, and ran scans. Quietly. Carefully. Gently. "You're about 10 weeks along," she said the next day. "You're lucky the baby is okay." I stared at the monitor showing a flickering heartbeat. My baby's heartbeat. Still alive. Still trying. I asked her why she was helping me. For free. She smiled and said, "Because years ago, someone helped me when I had nothing." I never forgot. That week, she became more than my doctor. She became my anchor, my secret keeper, my first true ally since the disaster of the wedding. She let me stay in the clinic's recovery suite for 3 nights. She called me brave when I told her about the wedding. She didn't say I was stupid for falling in love with Ethan Carrington. She only asked, "Do you still love him?" I didn't know how to answer that. Amara wasn't just a physician. She was a mirror, one that didn't lie. And in her presence, I began to see a version of myself I hadn't met before. The mother, the fighter, the survivor. Each night I sat on the clinic balcony, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the stars and whispering lullabies to the child I hadn't meant to create. I told it everything. About Ethan, about the dress, about the shame, about the silence. And I promised that it would never feel abandoned, even if I did. But fate doesn't hand you a safe place for free. On the 3rd night, Amara handed me some discharge paperwork. Just routine stuff. I signed where she pointed. Didn't read it. My mind was tired. But after I left the clinic and returned to my tiny apartment, Amara called me. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. I could hear the hesitation in her voice. The hospital record," she continued. "It listed the father's name. I didn't enter it, but it came from your file. It says, Carrington." My heart stopped. "What?" "Ethan Carrington. That name is now attached to your chart. It's in the system." I dropped the phone. My hands went cold. I stared at my reflection in the microwave door, and for the first time in weeks, I felt fear pulse through me, like lightning. I had hidden everything, buried every link, changed addresses, deleted old emails, and now, one autofilled form threatened to unravel it all. I had spent months trying to protect this child from the Carrington name, but now that name had found its way back to me, and someone connected to Ethan was already on their way. I thought I had buried the Carrington name with the shredded wedding invitations and the silence that followed Ethan's betrayal. But sometimes, the past doesn't need a door to return. Sometimes it only needs a single name, typed, printed, filed. And just like that, The life I was protecting cracked open from a place I thought no one would ever look, a hospital form. It was supposed to be a routine checkup. Amara was out that day, so another nurse handled intake. I sat on the crinkled white paper, the room cold, my back aching slightly from the weight I carried in more ways than one. The nurse, pleasant and mechanical, asked the usual questions: age, allergies, last period. Then she said it casually, almost as an afterthought, eyes on the clipboard. Father's name? I hesitated. My heart skipped. I could have lied, said unknown or private. But my lips moved before my logic could catch up. Ethan Carrington. She didn't blink. She just wrote it down. And I didn't correct her. I thought it didn't matter. That name. It had haunted me for months. I had erased it from my phone, my accounts, my future. But saying it aloud again, hearing it in that sterile room, felt like setting off a flare in the middle of the ocean. A week passed. I went back to work. Slept better. Eli's heartbeat remained strong. I let myself believe that I was safe again. Then I got the call. It was just past noon. My phone lit up with an unknown number. I almost let it ring out, but something made me answer. A voice, deep, smooth, and cold, spoke without introduction. "This is William Carrington." My blood ran cold. He didn't say hello, didn't ask if I remembered him. He got straight to the point. "I believe you're carrying my nephew." I froze, every bone in my body locked in place. How did he find me? Was it the hospital? The form? The name? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "We need to talk," he said. "Soon. In person." I wanted to hang up. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. But fear roots you to places you don't want to stay. We met the next day, at a quiet cafe tucked into a corner of the city. I didn't go alone. Amara sat at the table across the room, her eyes fixed on us like a hawk in scrubs. William was everything Ethan had once been, and more. Older, sharper, polished like a diamond with edges that could cut. He looked at me, not with anger, but calculation. Like a man measuring risk, he ordered tea. I ordered nothing. He leaned in and said, "Don't worry. I didn't come here to threaten you." I stayed silent. "I just want to know if it's true. Are you pregnant with my brother's child?" I could have denied it, but something in me was tired of hiding. "Yes," I said. "I am." He nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. "Ethan doesn't know," he said. "But he needs to. He's not well." My heart paused. "What do you mean?" "He's dying. A genetic blood condition. It's aggressive. Terminal." I stared at him. My mind couldn't process the words. He pushed a folded envelope across the table. "His doctors asked for family medical history. He refused to tell them about you. I had to dig to find out. Your file at the clinic had his name." I picked up the envelope, but didn't open it. "I'm not asking you for anything," he continued. "But if this baby is truly his, he deserves to know, before it's too late." I couldn't breathe. I thought Ethan was the end of my story, but now, death itself had opened a door back into our lives. William stood to leave. "I'm not like my mother," he said quietly. "If you ever need something, for the baby, I'll make sure you get it. You don't owe Ethan anything, but your child might." He walked out, leaving me in that cafe with shaking hands and a heart pounding with 1,000 unspoken memories. That night, I sat awake in bed, staring at the unopened envelope. I thought about the man who had held my hand during rainstorms, who kissed my knuckles, and promised me forever. The man who left me without looking back. I hated him. I loved him. I feared him. But more than that, I knew my child deserved the truth. So I made a choice. One I never thought I'd make again. I would see Ethan one last time, not for closure, not for revenge, but because the child he left behind was the only thing worth saving now, and time was running out. I expected to feel rage when I saw him again, to watch him with cold detachment and a wall built of everything he had done to me. But standing in the doorway of that hospital room, watching Ethan Carrington, once my groom, now a dying man, reach for a photo of the child he didn't know existed, I felt nothing I had prepared for. The grief in his eyes didn't belong to a billionaire. It belonged to a man who knew his time was slipping away, and the one person who could redeem it had already been born without him. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and regret. My palms were damp, and my legs felt hollow as a nurse led me to his room. She didn't know who I was, just that I was listed as a personal contact under instructions from William. I stood outside the door for a full minute before opening it. He was thinner, paler. His face had changed. No designer suit, no guarded charm, just hospital sheets, a monitor beeping slowly beside him, and tubes running into his arms like threads holding him together. Ethan looked up. Our eyes met. Silence filled the room. And then, his eyes dropped to the infant carrier in my hand. He sat up too fast, winced in pain, and clutched his side. "Is he?" His voice cracked. He couldn't finish the sentence. I nodded, slowly. "This is Eli," I said. "Your son." He stared at the baby like he'd seen a ghost. His hands trembled. Tears welled up and fell freely, not the kind you perform, but the kind that break through when you've lost control. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You didn't ask," I replied. His face crumbled. He leaned back, wiping his face with the thin blanket. "I didn't think you'd ever speak to me again." "I wasn't going to," I said. "But you're dying." He looked at Eli like he was made of glass. "He has your eyes," I added, softer than I meant to. He asked if he could hold him. My body tensed. My instincts screamed no. But something in me, maybe mercy, maybe closure, nodded yes. I placed Eli gently in his arms. Ethan held him like a man holding something sacred for the first time. He touched his tiny hand, smiled through tears, and whispered, "I never thought I'd be a father." I said nothing. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. I stared at him. "Do you even know what you're sorry for?" "For not staying. For being a coward. For letting them poison my mind about you. For everything." I looked away. It wasn't enough. Apologies didn't fill the months I spent alone, hiding, bleeding quietly from wounds no one saw. He asked about the pregnancy, the birth, the name. I gave him answers, but not warmth. He didn't deserve warmth. He said he wanted to spend time with Eli, as much as possible in the days he had left. I agreed, under supervision. He asked if I hated him. "I don't know what I feel," I said, "but I'll never forget what you did." And yet, over the next week, I watched a man try to make peace with the last thing he'd done right. He read to Eli, sang broken lullabies, told him stories of the stars. Every moment he had missed, he tried to fit into hours. He didn't talk about his sickness. He only talked about the baby. One night, he said, "I want to make sure he's protected." I assumed he meant financially, but the next morning, William handed me papers. Ethan had changed his will. Eli was now the sole heir to the Carrington fortune. It wasn't about the money. It was about the name, the legacy, the acknowledgement. And for the first time, the Carringtons couldn't erase me. But not everyone was pleased. Ethan's mother refused to visit. The board of directors began circling. The legal team started requesting documents. Ethan knew the storm was coming, and still, he smiled when Eli laughed. "Even if I die tomorrow," he said, "at least I saw this." He kissed Eli's forehead. That night he called me over. He was weaker, slower. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, "but I hope, maybe one day, Eli will know I tried." I didn't answer. I tucked the blanket tighter around his chest and nodded once before turning off the light. The next morning, the nurse called. He had passed away in his sleep, holding Eli's blanket in his hands. I had walked into that hospital to give a dying man the truth. What I walked out with was a newborn heir to a billion-dollar dynasty, and a war no one had prepared me for. I thought death would silence the war between me and the Carringtons, but I was wrong. Ethan's grave hadn't even settled when I realized they weren't mourning their son. They were preparing for battle, not against me. Against the tiny boy sleeping beside me, whose bloodline made him a Carrington, but whose birth made him a threat. My child wasn't just their heir. He was their fear-made flesh, and I was the woman who dared to keep him alive, outside their grasp. The funeral was quiet, too quiet. I stood alone by the casket, holding Eli in my arms, watching the wind stir the corners of a world that had never truly welcomed me. There were no headlines that day, no apologies, just one man buried with too many secrets, and a baby unaware of the storm his presence was about to ignite. William stood nearby, but even he couldn't see my eyes for long. He knew what was coming. Eli cooed softly against my chest, wrapping his tiny fingers around the black lace of my dress. That moment, so intimate, so human, was the last breath of peace we had. 3 days later, it arrived. A courier in a suit handed me a thick envelope embossed with the Carrington crest. I knew what it was before I opened it. I could feel the weight of old money, cold lawyers, and legacy warfare pressing through the paper. Inside was a formal legal notification. Subject: Petition for verification of inheritance and heirship dispute. They didn't say Eli. They didn't say your son. They said the alleged child. The words punched through my ribs harder than any slap. They weren't just denying his place. They were erasing his identity, as if Ethan's love, his voice, his will, meant nothing. As if my child was some mistake, scribbled on a napkin they could now throw away. I sat on the floor of Amara's guest room for hours, holding that letter, the rage curling through me like fire. This wasn't about grief. It was about bloodlines, control, ownership. And Eli, my baby, my miracle, was now a pawn in a game he couldn't even crawl through. The next morning, it was on every screen. Carrington clan questions maternity claim. Billionaire's secret son under legal scrutiny. Gold digger strikes again. They used the same photo of me from the day Ethan left me at the altar. Tears, mascara, broken expression frozen in digital time. They never let me move forward. And now, they wanted to drag my son into the same pit. William called. He said, "I'm sorry. I tried to stop them. But trying wasn't enough. Not anymore." They sent offers, generous settlements that came with silence. One-time payments, trusts, promises of education. All I had to do was disappear, hand over Eli, and let them shape his life without the woman who carried him through pain, isolation, and betrayal. I declined. And so they escalated. They brought out their finest lawyers, men in polished shoes and $1,000 suits who spoke in polished cruelty. They questioned our timeline, accused me of forging the will, claimed Ethan was under mental distress when he signed it. They even hired a private investigator to dig into my past, my medical records, my apartment lease. They contacted old classmates. I tried to contact my father, dug into every corner of my life that I had fought to rebuild. Still, I stood tall, because I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the boy who giggled in his sleep, the boy who curled his tiny fingers around mine at night, the boy who had already lost his father and would not lose his identity too. Amara brought in advocates, support groups, a pro bono legal team who had fought wealthy families before. Together, we built a case not just of facts, but of truth. I showed them DNA evidence, hospital records, Ethan's final video message. In it, Ethan held Eli and whispered, "I don't know how much time I have left. But this, he's my time. He's what matters now." I submitted the video to court. The room went silent when it played. But the Carringtons weren't done. They brought in experts to question the video's authenticity, hired digital analysts to say the clip could have been edited. claimed Ethan had been emotionally coerced. They didn't want the truth. They wanted dominance. And then, the worst blow came from Ethan's mother. She took the stand, poised, cold, merciless. She looked at me and said, "This woman tricked my son. She was never part of this family." She looked at Eli and said, "We don't even know if that child is his." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply opened my bag, pulled out the envelope I had kept hidden, and handed it to the judge. Inside, a notarized letter from Ethan, written 3 days before he died. It read, "If I don't make it, please know. Eli is mine. I failed him once. Please don't let them take him from her." The judge read it aloud. The courtroom fell silent. That day, I walked out believing we had won. But power doesn't die easily, especially when it wears diamonds and writes laws. I had braced myself for the inheritance fight, but I wasn't ready for what came next, a full custody lawsuit. The Carringtons weren't just trying to erase my name from their history. They were preparing to take my son away from me completely. And this time, they weren't offering money. They were coming with lawyers, lies, and legacy, armed to win. They had already tried to erase Ethan's will, questioned the bloodline of my child, and painted my survival as a scandal. But when all that failed, they changed their weapon. Now, instead of trying to strip away what Ethan had left behind, they came for the only thing I had truly built with my own 2 hands, my bond with my son. They called it a custody petition, dressed in legalese and etiquette, but I saw it clearly for what it was, a declaration of war from a family who refused to accept defeat. This time, they weren't fighting me for money. They were trying to tear out my motherhood, piece by piece, in the coldest room a woman can stand in, a courtroom. After the break-in at my apartment, there was no second thought. I packed our things and moved into Amara's home, not just for protection, but for the sanity I felt slipping from me with every whisper of Carrington interference. I thought the worst had already passed, and believed that once Ethan's will had been honored and Eli was safe in my arms, the silence that followed would be permanent. But grief, when wrapped in wealth and pride, doesn't lead to healing. It hardens into vengeance. The envelope arrived 7 days later, carried by a man who didn't smile, didn't blink, and didn't need to say anything. The weight of what he handed me said enough. Inside was a petition from Vivian Carrington herself, demanding full legal custody of my son, claiming I was emotionally unstable, financially unfit, and unworthy of raising what she called the final hope of the Carrington legacy. I read those words again and again, and each time they landed deeper, not because I believed them, but because I understood exactly how much power they carried when spoken in the right circles. I had survived Ethan's abandonment, the online humiliation, the whispers in hospitals and courtrooms, but this felt different. This felt like they had finally found the one battlefield where they knew I would bleed the most, because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a boy who laughed when I kissed his toes, who calmed when he heard my heartbeat, who only knew the world through the softness of my voice and the steadiness of my hands. And now they wanted to take that from him, and from me. The media circled like vultures around fresh blood. My face returned to headlines that never bothered to update the truth. Ethan's mother was painted as a grieving grandmother seeking justice. I was reduced to clickbait again. Unstable woman clinging to billionaire baby. They didn't ask about the sleepless nights. They didn't question who had rocked him through colic, who had kissed his fevered cheeks, who had fed him with trembling hands while trying not to collapse herself. All they saw was drama wrapped in diamonds and ratings. But I wasn't alone anymore. Amara stood behind me like steel. She rallied lawyers, therapists, advocates, people who believed that motherhood wasn't measured by money, but by presence, consistency, and love. We documented everything: doctor visits, feeding schedules, growth charts, baby books filled with my handwriting. I brought not just evidence, but memory. I wasn't showing them how I raised a child. I was showing them why. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The lights were too white. The silence too heavy. Vivian Carrington sat at the far table, dressed in black pearls, posture perfect, her expression carved from marble. She didn't need to speak cruelty. Her lawyers did it for her, cloaked in eloquence and legacy. They called me emotionally compromised. They painted my fight for survival as chaos. They suggested Eli would be better served in a structured, powerful home with access to private education and influence. They claimed I was too broken to offer him the stability he needed. I didn't cry. I stood and spoke, not for defense, but for declaration. I told them about the day Ethan left me at the altar, about finding out I was pregnant in the silence of grief, about collapsing alone and waking up not with fear, but with resolve. I told them about holding Eli for the first time and knowing that he was not the mistake Ethan ran from. He was the miracle I ran toward. I told them that I hadn't just raised him. I had fought for him every step, even when no one fought for me. Witnesses came forward. Co-workers, neighbors, even parents of my students, each sharing moments they had seen, quiet acts of motherhood that courts often forget to measure. Amara's testimony was precise and powerful. She didn't vouch for me. She honored me. She spoke of strength built from ruins, of a woman who refused to collapse under pressure because she had something greater to protect. And then, unexpectedly, William stood. He wasn't called. He wasn't required. But he walked forward and asked to speak. He looked at the judge, then at his mother, and then at me. He said, "My brother may not be here to defend the truth, but I am. I've seen that child. I've seen how he looks at her. I've seen how she never once asked for a thing, but gave him everything." He turned to the judge and said one more thing that I will never forget. "You don't have to be born a Carrington to be the best part of one." The silence in that room was different. He had shifted something, not just in the court, but in me. The judge asked for closing remarks. I held Eli's bracelet in my palm and said, "I am not a perfect woman, but I am a constant one, and I am the only home my son has ever known. Please don't take that from him." When the ruling came, it felt like the final heartbeat of a war I never wanted, but had been forced to survive. Sole custody granted to me, petition denied. But as I stood outside the courthouse holding Eli in my arms, I saw William watching us, not with judgment, but with something else, something quiet, something steady. And when he walked over, placed Ethan's old watch into my hand, and said, he'd want his son to have this, I realized the fight may have ended, but something new was beginning. I didn't yet understand what it meant, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. I had spent so long learning how to survive alone that I forgot what it felt like to be gently held without demand. I never imagined the brother of the man who broke me would be the one to bring me peace in silence, comfort in chaos, and warmth without asking for anything in return. While the world still questioned my worth, he stood beside me not to replace Ethan, but to undo the damage he left behind. And somehow, in the quiet spaces between grief and healing, I began to wonder if this Carrington wasn't a threat, but an answer. After the courtroom doors had closed and the verdict stamped in my favor, I expected silence. Not celebration, not peace, just stillness. That's all I craved. But stillness, I learned, doesn't always come in the absence of noise. It sometimes comes in the form of a person. William had been present throughout the custody trial, but now he lingered. Not like a shadow, not as an obligation. He stayed like someone who didn't need a reason anymore. At first, I thought he was only checking in on Eli. Then I thought maybe he felt guilty, carrying the Carrington name while watching his family try to dismantle mine. But I was wrong. He came because he wanted to, not to fix what was broken, but to sit beside it without flinching. He would arrive in the mornings with coffee and leave after bedtime stories. He began picking up groceries I hadn't asked for, fixing hinges I'd ignored, reading Eli the same book every night with the patience of someone who knew a child's trust wasn't something you earned. It was something you respected. Eli adored him. It started as playfulness, crawling into his lap, reaching for his arms when the thunder rolled. But slowly, it grew into something quieter, deeper. He began asking where Will was before breakfast. He waited by the window at dusk, watching for the headlights of a car that felt like family before it even parked. I watched it all from a distance at first, arms crossed, heart guarded. I'd been here before, drawn into charm, misled by warmth, tricked into believing that love would be enough. But William wasn't Ethan. He didn't speak in grand gestures. He didn't make promises. He just stayed, quiet, consistent, kind. The guilt gnawed at me. How could I even consider letting him in? He shared blood with the man who abandoned me in my wedding dress, the man whose last message to me was one of retreat, not redemption. And yet, William's presence didn't remind me of Ethan. It erased him. Every time I expected manipulation, William responded with gentleness. When I flinched from old wounds, he stood still, patient, not trying to fix them, but letting me know he'd wait until I didn't need to flinch anymore. I found myself laughing, again. Cooking meals that didn't come from a microwave. Playing music during the day instead of keeping the house in silence. I even caught myself humming, something I hadn't done since my pregnancy. One stormy night, the electricity blinked twice before shutting off completely. Eli began to cry, thunder shaking the windows like a beast trying to claw in from the outside. Before I could even move, William had wrapped Eli in a blanket and cradled him like he'd done it 100 times before. He whispered lullabies I didn't know he knew, brushing Eli's curls back with the gentlest touch I'd ever seen from a Carrington. I stood in the doorway, soaking in the scene like it was something I wasn't supposed to witness. William looked up, and in a voice so soft it barely carried over the storm, he said, "I'd stay forever if you let me." I didn't reply, but I didn't ask him to leave either. The air changed that night. Something unspoken bloomed and hung between us like a fragile thread neither of us dared pull. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself wonder, what if this was what safety could feel like? In the days that followed, William's presence became seamless. He began helping with Eli's early education, bringing books, building wooden puzzles, even offering to attend pediatric checkups. He never crossed boundaries, never assumed, but every gesture felt like an invitation, not just to co-parent, but to breathe again beside someone who didn't want to own me, only witness me. Then came the moment that neither of us could have planned for. Eli had just woken from a nap. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard his tiny feet pad across the hallway floor. "Will!" he shouted excitedly, and then, softer, barely a whisper, "Daddy." The word didn't shatter the silence. It hallowed it. William froze. He turned to Eli slowly, kneeling down to his level. His voice trembled. "What did you say, buddy?" Eli smiled, arms open wide, full of unfiltered love and innocence. "Daddy." The breath in my lungs caught like fabric snagged on a nail. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't planted. It wasn't pretend. It was real. And it was pure. William didn't respond right away. He just pulled Eli close, held him like he was afraid the boy might disappear, and for the first time, I saw William break. Not with sadness, but with something far more powerful. He had been trying not to feel too much, trying not to cross a line that even he wasn't sure he should approach. But Eli had drawn it for him, and suddenly, none of us could pretend we didn't see it anymore. I had prepared myself for custody trials, betrayals, and loss, but I hadn't prepared for this moment, for this shift in our world where trust didn't just survive. It grew. Eli's voice still echoed through my heart, a single word that redefined everything. I saw it in William's trembling hands, in the tears he didn't bother to hide, in the silence that asked me for nothing but truth. And I knew then that the next choice I made wouldn't be about survival. It would be about love, legacy, and whether I could allow my heart to finally hope again. He didn't kneel beneath fairy lights, didn't come with violins or champagne. He simply stood beside me in the quiet, offering something far rarer than luxury. The steadiness of someone who had witnessed every part of my unraveling and still asked to stay. William never chased grandeur, never tried to fix me with words. Instead, he handed me a letter folded with intention, its edges soft from the weight of waiting, and in it, a life not built on fantasies, but on survival, choice, and the hope that healing together was still possible. That moment didn't glitter like a diamond. It breathed like safety. It was Eli's 3rd birthday, a rainy morning filled with balloons that drooped and giggles that soared. I had prepared a simple cake, the kind with frosting that smears more on fingers than plates, and the house buzzed with that delicate kind of joy only toddlers bring, the kind that reminds you the world can still be soft. In the middle of the laughter, while Amara refilled teacups and Eli painted frosting onto William's face, he slipped a white envelope into my hand. No audience, no build-up, just the same quiet William I had come to rely on. Inside, written in that slow, thoughtful handwriting I'd memorized from grocery lists and bedtime notes, were the words, "If you'll have me, I'd like to be part of your miracle. For life. No ring, no deadline, just a promise." I didn't cry because I was caught off guard. I cried because for once I wasn't afraid of the future someone was offering me. Because here was a man who had held my broken pieces, not like a puzzle to solve, but like precious glass to protect. He had shown up not only when it was easy, but when I was unlovable, raw, and rebuilding. And now, he wasn't asking to replace what had been lost. He was asking to become what we had earned. We didn't talk about dates. There was no venue, no dress fittings, no countdown. Only a plan to gather under Amara's tree with Eli by our side and say what needed to be said, not for the world, but for the home we had created, quietly, fiercely, together. But the quiet never lasts when power feels threatened, and Vivian Carrington had been too silent for too long. A week before our planned ceremony, another envelope arrived, this time cold, official, and thicker than any we had received before. My hands trembled before I even opened it, because I already knew. She wasn't done with us. Inside were papers filed through her legal team, not for custody this time, but for grandparental rights. Another war, framed in legal terms, but loaded with the same agenda: dominance, control, and erasure of my motherhood. She wasn't suing for love. She was suing for visibility. Her claim read like a familiar echo: I was isolating the child, limiting access to essential blood ties, and damaging the emotional development of a rightful Carrington heir. But beneath those words, I saw the truth. She was clawing her way back into relevance using the one thing she had always resented: my son. William's jaw tightened as he read the first page. She doesn't care about Eli. She cares that the world might forget her name, he said, the words more grief than anger. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was too tight, because this wasn't about legal access. It was about inserting herself into every photo, every milestone, every story Eli would carry about who his family was. We had just started to breathe, and she was trying to suffocate us again. The wedding was postponed, not because I doubted William, but because I couldn't walk toward forever with a storm still forming behind us. We needed to protect Eli first. Our legal team warned us that grandparental rights were murky, manipulated easily by public sympathy and courtroom performance. They told us to prepare for a narrative where Vivian was the victim, cut off from her bloodline by a bitter mother and a brainwashed uncle. I wanted to scream, but instead, I gathered every birthday video, every text she never sent, every silence she offered while we begged for peace. I wasn't just building a case. I was defending my child's right to grow up in truth, not legacy fiction. William stood beside me through every hour. He didn't try to fix it. He just stayed close enough for me to lean on, far enough to let me fight in my own voice. "I didn't give you a ring," he said one night as we reviewed documents, "but I'll give you my strength. Every time. As long as you want it." I didn't answer with words. I just let my tears fall on his shoulder, because I knew they would be safe there. Just when I thought our battles were finally behind us, her silence returned with ink and signatures, another attempt to invade our peace, to claim pieces of a life she never built. This wasn't about a boy she missed. It was about a legacy she feared losing. As I stared at the new lawsuit, my hands no longer shook, not from fear, but from fury. She hadn't come to join our story. She had come to rewrite it, and I would not let her steal our truth. Not now. Not ever. I never dreamed of raising a child beneath fluorescent courtroom lights, never imagined defending bedtime stories and lullabies in front of strangers with clipboards and verdicts. But when they backed me into another trial, when love was treated like a liability and biology like a battlefield, I knew silence was no longer an option. They didn't just question my motherhood. They challenged my soul, and if that meant standing alone once more to keep my son safe, then I would do it without flinching. Because this wasn't a legal case. It was war disguised in paperwork. Vivian Carrington didn't show up with flowers. She came armed with lawyers, headlines, and a new narrative, one crafted carefully to cut deeper than any insult. The case was filed just days before our rescheduled ceremony. I had just zipped up Eli's tiny vest for the photos when the doorbell rang. Another envelope, another ambush. She demanded weekly visitation, input into Eli's schooling, and full recognition as his legal grandparent. Her lawyers used everything they could find, edited video clips from school fundraisers, screenshots of old emotional posts, even Amara's private clinic records, all twisted to paint me as manipulative, controlling, unstable. "She's painting herself as a wounded grandmother," William said, jaw tight as he read the paperwork. "And you as the warden who locked her out." I nodded slowly. The game hadn't changed, just the costume. This courtroom felt different, colder, not because the walls had changed, but because this time I knew exactly what was at stake. Eli was no longer a baby. He could speak, he could be confused, and I wouldn't let him be used. The trial began on a Thursday morning. Rain tapped the windows like a slow, steady warning. As we entered, reporters stood outside, waiting to spin this into another headline. I walked past them holding Eli's drawing in my coat pocket. It was a picture of me, William, and himself standing beneath a tree. No one else was in it. I held on to that truth. Vivian looked elegant. She always did. But behind the veils and brooches was a woman clinging to legacy like a lifeline. Her lawyers went first. They played audio clips, read emails out of context, referenced articles that painted me as volatile and guarded. They claimed I denied Vivian access out of spite, not protection. They accused William of being emotionally compromised and hinted that Eli was being used to secure Carrington assets. Then they called me to the stand. The walk to that seat felt endless. Every step echoed louder than the last. But I sat tall. I was asked if I had purposely kept Eli from the Carrington family. I said, no. They kept themselves away. They asked if I'd used William's affection to replace Ethan's memory. I said, Ethan chose absence. William chose presence. My son chose love. They asked if I had influenced Eli to see Vivian as a villain. I said, he never had to be told anything. He simply noticed who showed up. Then came the question that shattered the room into quiet. What does Eli mean to you? I looked up through the glass, toward the seat where he once sat, curled in William's arms. And I said, voice firm but shaking at its core, he's not just my son. He's my survival. He's every breath I took when the world told me to give up. He's the miracle I never asked for, but the reason I never stopped fighting. There was no follow-up, only silence. And then, testimony began. Amara took the stand first. She detailed every visit, every medical document, every moment of support. She reminded the court that Eli's birth wasn't the Carrington family's burden. It was their ignored blessing. William followed. He didn't speak as a Carrington. He spoke as a man who had chosen family over legacy. "He's not my blood," he said, voice steady, "but he's my purpose, and I'm proud of who he calls Daddy." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Vivian turned red, then pale. Then one final surprise. A nurse from Ethan's final days appeared. She had not been called by us. She came of her own accord. "I saw him," she told the court. And Ethan wasn't confused. He asked for his will to be honored because he knew he had failed. He wanted his son protected from everything he didn't become. With those words, the walls that Vivian had built around her narrative began to crack. The judge recessed, then returned. Ruling, petition denied, permanently. All grandparental claims revoked. There were no cheers, just tears. Because it was finally, truly, over. As I stepped out of that courtroom, I didn't feel victory. I felt transformation. I wasn't just walking away with a ruling. I was walking into a life no longer dictated by fear. For the first time, I wasn't defending a wound. I was standing inside the woman I had become. And I realized something that startled me in its power. I was no longer surviving. I was rebuilding something far stronger. A future. There was a time when I couldn't walk into a grocery store without hearing whispers, when I was known only as the girl who got left at the altar and carried a Carrington secret. But somewhere between the courtrooms and quiet nights, between Eli's laughter and William's steady hands, I shed that skin. I wasn't just the subject of someone else's scandal anymore. I had become the voice I once needed, louder than shame, stronger than gossip, and finally, rooted in something that could not be taken away. Purpose. With the custody wars behind us, and Vivian's interference legally closed for good, I found myself standing in a kind of silence I hadn't felt in years, not the cold stillness of fear, but the soft quiet of peace. The kind that lets you exhale fully, the kind that gives you room to look back, not with rage, but with clarity. And in that stillness, I found a new calling. I launched the Miracle Project, a foundation built for women like me, women who had been left behind, women who were told they were too emotional, too difficult, too invisible to fight back, women who were once celebrated as brides but forgotten as mothers. We started small, just housing referrals and one pro bono lawyer, but the mission was clear. No woman should have to choose between safety and survival. Within 6 months, we had secured donations from unexpected places. A few media interviews reopened the old scandal, yes, but this time, it didn't come with shame. It came with solidarity. Women across the country wrote letters, emails, and handwritten notes thanking me for telling the story they were never allowed to speak out loud. William helped me build every piece, not as a headline or a wealthy backer, but as a man who believed in the work because he had seen what silence does to someone you love. He showed up for meetings, coordinated press outreach, and quietly handled background logistics no one else wanted to do. He never asked for attention. He just made sure I could shine. Eli became the foundation's beating heart. His smile lit up photos, his giggles filled rooms, and every time he hugged a woman walking through our shelter doors, they cried. Not because they knew his story, but because they felt his warmth, his innocence, his untouched joy. We hosted charity dinners. We created a legal defense fund. We hired therapists who had once been clients. And every time I stood on a stage, told my truth, and looked out at faces who once would have judged me, I saw empathy instead of pity. One night, after a fundraiser gala, a young woman approached me in tears. "I was you," she whispered, "before I knew I could be me." That moment stayed with me longer than any applause. But it was Eli who reminded me of why I had chosen to lead instead of hide. His first preschool painting was handed to me on a Monday afternoon, the paper still damp with paint and the edges crumpled from too much love. In the center, a large heart. Inside it, a stick figure of him with curly hair, and beside it, me holding his hand. "That's us," he beamed. "And that's the heart you live in." I laughed. "And what's Mommy doing in the painting?" "She's being my hero." I turned away to hide my tears, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally believed him. For so long, I had worn guilt like a second skin, for being pregnant, for staying, for leaving, for surviving. But in that moment, with construction paper and red paint in my hand, I realized something vital. I hadn't just fallen in love again. I had rebuilt the woman Ethan left behind. She didn't vanish. She evolved. And as our quiet wedding approached, I knew this time I would walk down the aisle with no doubt, no fear, only gratitude for the story I had written for myself. William and I chose a date in early spring. Nothing lavish, just a backyard, a few friends, and vows whispered beneath the tree that had seen our softest days. But peace, as always, was never the end of the story. Just as we finalized the last ceremony details, a letter arrived. No legal stamps, no bolded threats, just my name, in Ethan's handwriting. I stood frozen at the mailbox, the world blurring around me. Because Ethan was gone. And yet, his voice had returned. As I turned the letter over in my hands, something inside me pulsed with a mix of fear, closure, and wonder. How could a dead man still hold one last secret? How could his words reach across years of silence and still make my heart tremble? William watched, from the porch, sensing the weight in my stare. I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't know what it held. But something told me this wasn't just a goodbye. It was a truth buried deep enough to break us, or bind us forever. There are moments in life when a hand reaches back from the past, not to hurt, not to reopen wounds, but to offer something soft, something final. That letter arrived on a quiet morning, sealed in Ethan's familiar handwriting, carrying the weight of a man who had broken me, and yet somehow still held pieces of my healing. I wasn't prepared for what it would say, but I knew, from the way my heart tightened as I held it, that his voice had come not to haunt me, but to free me. It arrived a week before the wedding, tucked inside a faded brown envelope with no return address. William found it in the mailbox, holding it carefully, silently, as if he could already sense it didn't belong to this moment, but to a different version of our story. He handed it to me without a word. The handwriting was unmistakable. Ethan's sharp loops and slanted letters that once filled birthday cards and apology notes. My breath caught as I turned it over, my fingers tracing the seal that hadn't cracked in years. It was addressed to both me and Eli. The date on the back was scribbled in blue ink, marked just weeks before Ethan's death. I sat on the edge of our bed, letter pressed to my chest, and let the weight of it settle over me. This wasn't just ink and paper. It was a final chapter waiting to be read. With trembling hands, I opened it. The first line broke me. "If you're reading this, it means you stayed." His words poured out like a confession, not just of fear or guilt, but of truth he had never managed to say aloud. He wrote about the day he left me at the altar, not with excuses, but with naked honesty. "I didn't run because I didn't love you. I ran because I didn't love myself enough to believe I deserved you." He wrote about Eli, how he had learned about the pregnancy through William, too late to return, too ashamed to try. He wrote about the nights he sat in hospital rooms battling his illness, wondering what kind of father he might have been if he had just stayed. And then came the part I read aloud in a whisper. "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him he wasn't a mistake. Tell him I loved him from the moment I saw him. even if I didn't stay to prove it. I didn't cry right away. I read the letter 3 times before I folded it gently and held it against my chest, like it was something fragile and holy. That night, I sat beside Eli in bed and read it to him. Not every word, not the heavy ones, but the parts that mattered. I told him, "Your daddy loved you." He didn't ask questions. He just wrapped his little arms around me and said, "I love you more." We decided to bury the letter together, under the old tree behind our house, the one that had stood witness to every chapter of our new beginning. I let Eli place the small box in the soil. "This is for Daddy Ethan," he whispered, and I whispered back, "and for the peace we never thought we'd find." The wedding came with sunlight and music, not orchestras or chandeliers, but wildflowers, friends, and the quiet certainty of something earned. Eli carried the rings in a box shaped like a heart. William cried before I did, just one tear sliding down his cheek as I walked toward him, past the tree, through the laughter, holding everything I had once thought was lost. When I said I do, I didn't feel the absence of Ethan. I felt the presence of every version of myself I had fought through. I didn't marry William to forget. I married him because what we had created, this life, this family, this miracle, was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be honest. We danced that night beneath fairy lights Eli insisted on hanging with his plastic ladder. Amara toasted us with a shaky voice, and the wind through the trees felt like a blessing from a past that had finally found its peace. In the end, my miracle was never just about motherhood or survival. It was about becoming the kind of woman I needed when everything was falling apart. Ethan may have written the last letter, but I was the one who closed the story, with grace, with strength, and with love that outlasted the grief. And as I tucked Eli into bed that night, our last chapter written, our vows finally spoken, I realized something I had never dared to believe. I was never just meant to raise a son. I was meant to rise, because of him. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because every week I bring you tales that aren't just stories, but survival. Leave a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in her place? And if you believe in the strength of second chances, share this video with someone who needs hope today. Your voice matters here, just like hers did.